Hello, I'm Dr. Selpi Yalda from Millersville University. I'm a professor of meteorology, but I also serve as the director for the Center for Disaster Research and Education. I have also been able to develop and oversee programs in emergency management at our university. And I will speak with you a little bit later about some of the offerings that we have that may be of interest with you towards the end of this presentation. In October of 2024, I had the unique opportunity and privilege to visit your beautiful country. And in the context of my research and teaching, I had the opportunity to meet with some of the officials, school officials, principals, teachers, and even some students. Seeing your schools and where you teach and where you are helping your students to learn and succeed provided me with a very nice basis to be able to share some tips with you today to hopefully help you in terms of preparing for disasters in general, but specifically for the purpose of this webinar for earthquake preparedness. We will start with some basics on earthquake background, and then we'll go into some more information that is focused on earthquake preparedness. I put together a couple of learning objectives, as I'm sure you will develop your own learning objectives as we go through, and hopefully we'll pick up some information that would be of use for you as you go through your teaching with your students. Some of these learning objectives are through this particular presentation, we will have some basic fundamentals on earthquakes and associated earthquake hazards. We will talk about some of the resources that are available in terms of earthquakes, both portals and websites that can provide you with real-time earthquake information and also data that you may be able to use in your classrooms, depending on what you teach. In some cases, it may be applicable, and in some cases, it may not. But you can still use a lot of that information in different settings, and I'll go through that a little bit later on in this presentation. We will also focus on really the topic of this webinar, which is learning about earthquake preparedness as it applies to schools and you as teachers and educators. We will also differentiate between the responsibilities of schools and teachers and how that can really interact with one another, really sort of help inform each other, and also can extend to the community. I understood very well that in the Philippines, the schools are really important community centers and really serve an important role. So it's really important to think about ways that we can engage the community, and that only improves the preparedness, planning, and eventually safety if a disaster happens. We will also touch upon, again, the importance of community, which I just mentioned, but we will also build on your existing knowledge, which I'm sure you know a lot about a lot of these topics, but hopefully to build on that knowledge to create some more concrete responsibilities and action items that can help with preparedness as we move forward. I'm sure it's no surprise to you that your country has been affected and is being affected by a number of natural hazards or disasters. There are a variety of reports, which also I have referenced most of this information at the end of this presentation on a separate slide under references, so you can obviously access all of those, and I will also be available for any questions that you may have on any of this information. If we look at the United Nations report, we see that Philippines is one of the countries that is most prone to natural disasters in the world. And of course, as a result of climate change, some of these disasters are becoming more of an issue. For example, sea level rise. And you're familiar with the statistics in terms of the different types of events, but I wanted to draw your attention to this diagram. That's basically a risk index. So when we look at risk index, we can also look at the different types of disasters and how they rank in terms of their risk index. What risk index takes into account, it also includes vulnerability. So not only that a disaster is happening in a particular region, but what are the vulnerabilities of that region in terms of their level of preparedness, and also the population and their ability to recover during a disaster, and also recovery after a disaster. So extremely important. And since this webinar focuses on earthquake preparedness, I did want to draw your attention to earthquakes and their rather high risk index when we look at a risk index score of 0 to 10, 10 being the highest. So you can see a 9.7 is quite high. And these reports also, they go back, I believe that the latest one that's available, the World Risk Index report, is from 2024. So we're looking at some recent information here. So before we get into earthquake preparedness, I thought that it would be important just to have a very brief discussion on fundamentals of earthquakes. Again, I'm sure that as part of your training, or perhaps even for some of you in terms of your expertise and what you teach, you may know a lot more than what is going to be presented. But this is just to provide a little bit of background on earthquakes. Before we get started on earthquakes, it's really important to understand the structure of the earth. And again, if we look at this sort of a cartoon diagram here that shows the components of the earth, which is, the crust, the mantle, and the core of the earth. And as you know, the core has two components, the inner, which is solid, and the outer, which is the molten liquid. And of course, we have the crust, which is really important, which is that kind of that surface layer that we're familiar with. And what's interesting about this crust layer, or the top part of the mantle, is that it kind of creates a thin surface or thin skin on the surface of the earth. So now we're ready to kind of see what is the definition of earthquakes. And again, it's not hard to come up with a definition, but if you look at different sources, this is one that kind of stands out. So an earthquake is the shaking of the Earth's surface resulting from a sudden release of energy in that top layer, that sudden release of energy creates those waves, and then those waves are what lead to what we feel at the surface of the Earth. There are different types of earthquakes, so I quickly touch upon these. There are the tectonic earthquakes, which are basically the result of the Earth's crust breaking due to different forces, movement of the plates, and along fault lines, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Then there are volcanic earthquakes, which, as the name indicates, they're directly related to volcanic activity, such as magma movements or eruptions. And then there are collapse earthquakes, which are related to any kind of activity that is under the surface, whether they're mines or caves, and any changes in the structure of them. And then also last are the explosion earthquakes. A lot of these are triggered by activities that are human-made, so there could be human-made explosions or other types of activities that could, again, disrupt that surface of the earth or create some disruption to the underneath structures. So let's quickly look at tectonic earthquakes, and we won't look at each and every one in detail, but I did want to point out the tectonic earthquakes because these are important in terms of they are, in a sense, a result of the movement that occurs along the boundaries of the plates, or that ring of fire, which I'm sure you know, since the Philippines is located on that ring of fire. So this, movement along these boundaries is what really creates that energy that we talked about before, that then produces those seismic waves. And those waves propagate through the earth, and then the ground surface starts to shake, which is what we feel. So as I mentioned, the Ring of Fire, the Philippines, as you're aware, sits within the Pacific Ring of Fire, in that horseshoe shape that you can clearly see on this diagram. And it goes over a fairly large area of about 40,000 kilometers. And the basin is in the Pacific Ocean. And this is where, of course, it's prone to earthquakes and, of course, volcanic activity as well. So remember that we talked about these kind of boundaries, right? And these plates. So it's really important to talk about now the faults, right? Because the faults are really what lead to the earthquake activity that we see. So a fault is really a fracture or zone of fractures in the Earth's crust. So remember, we have the crust and we said that is sort of a skin, but it's sort of uneven. So these faults that are created, they are kind of these, a fracture or a zone of fractures on the crust. And they kind of move past each other, but there are different types of them. So there's the normal fault, and then there's reverse fault, and then there's strike slip fault. So what you see in the parentheses is what actually kind of leads to these. So whether it's tension or compression or transverse slips. I want to point out that in the Philippines, as you may already be aware, the most common types of faults are this last one, the strike slip or transverse, and the other one are the reverse faults. So these last two are the most common. And I'll just briefly explain each of them, not going into too much detail. But basically the ones that are we'll start with the top left one, which are the normal faults. So normal faults mainly occur in areas where the crust is being extended as a result of divergent, or you can see they're kind of going out, diverging in a divergent boundary. These are usually not very strong earthquakes. They're usually less than magnitude 7, and they are fairly limited because they're just along those centers that are diverging. The next one is the reverse. These occur in areas where the crust is shortened as a result of compression. So as you can see, these arrows, they're being compressed. And this are usually associated with really powerful earthquakes. So these earthquakes are, all of them are magnitude 8 or higher. So these are pretty strong ones. And if we look at data, we'll see that this type of, earthquakes, these really strong earthquakes, are responsible for about 90% of the total movement, total sort of seismic activity, and that is released worldwide. So they're pretty important because they're the ones that are creating those very strong earthquakes. And then last one is the strike slip or transverse fault, and these basically occur where the two sides of the fault slip horizontally past each other. So you can kind of see they're sort of going horizontally past each other. These can also produce some major earthquakes up to about magnitude 8, but not beyond. So it's kind of important to look at all of these faults and understand, because this is what really leads to the formation of those earthquakes. So two more kind of important terminology that I wanted to share with you, because you probably have heard this a lot, the epicenter and the hypocenter. And these are important because epicenter, as you know, it marks the location of the earthquake on the surface, and the hypocenter is the location that is underneath the surface, right? So below the surface of the earth. So that's important to know. I'm not going to go through this slide. I just wanted to make it available to you so you can see some of the useful concepts. So if there's something that I mention and you want to go back, you can go back and look at some of those definitions. Of course, you can always look these up as well through the references provided. So now that we have a feel for what is an earthquake, what are the different types of earthquake, and then how those formations or those movements are along the boundaries of the plates and also the faults contribute to the development of motion on the surface of the earth. So why is that shake created? Again, just like we saw in all of those different types of faults, the edges of faults are kind of stuck together. The rest of the block is kind of moving. So it causes the blocks to kind of slide past each other, or if they're being compressed, or there's the divergence. So what happens is it creates this kind of built up of energy, and that energy, when that energy is released, That energy radiates outward from the fault in all directions in the form of those seismic waves that we mentioned. Just like if you throw a stone in a pond, you can see that it creates that energy, and then there are those waves that are created, and you can see them sometimes for a long time. The seismic waves then kind of, shake the earth as they move through it, right? So they kind of create that shaking as they move through, and that's what we feel at the surface of the earth. Earthquakes are usually recorded using a seismograph, and this is just a schematic of a seismograph, so you can see that how they're recorded. And it is the difference between, where the shaking part of the seismograph and the motionless part of what is recorded. So that's how we come up with what we see here, which is the seismograph, which is what we see as a record of those movements that are created at the surface of the earth, and then the instrument that records it. So typically we see these seismograms that are the recording of what the seismograph measures. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. We typically think about magnitude of an earthquake. You probably have heard this. I just mentioned this quite a bit when we were talking about, for example, reverse faults leading to, along those convergent boundaries, which would give us those very strong earthquakes of magnitude 8 or higher. So magnitude is usually expressed in whole numbers, and it varies because it depends on when we measure the magnitude, the shaking that is caused and the measurement of it is the magnitude depends on lots of things, depends on distance, type, and surface materials and other factors. But we do have a range, so it's usually in whole numbers and also decimal fractions. So you can see, for example, a magnitude of 5.8, a 5.3 is a moderate earthquake, and a 6.3 is a strong earthquake. And then, of course, we're talking about those very strong earthquakes of magnitude 8 or higher. And this just shows a graphic to show you the kind of those connections between distance, type, and other factors that go into measurement of the magnitude. In the Philippines, as you know, there is a scale that is used. Now, this is not magnitude, but it's an intensity scale that is established by the Philippines Institute of Volcanology and Seismology. And this particular scale was developed to take into account different geography and other geological consideration to develop this intensity scale. And this intensity scale is very good and very applicable in the Philippines because it does look at, the effect of an earthquake based on the area that it has impacted. So relative to people, structures, and objects in the surroundings. So it's a very useful intensity scale in this setting. Again, this is just a table to show you this particular earthquake intensity scale. So you can see if you start looking at the left-hand side column, that gives you the intensity scale. And then, of course, the descriptions, and then the categories that are listed. So you can get a feel for how it also relates to other types of scales that are in common use in other parts of the world. So as you know, earthquakes are not the only disasters that affect the Philippines, and we talked about this a little bit earlier in those first few slides. But if we look at here and we just focus our attention on our earthquake intensity and just looking at these various colors that show the degrees that we had seen on the previous slide, you can see it doesn't take a long time that we can just glance at some of this information and notice that earthquakes and strong earthquakes are something that we really need to focus on and think about very seriously, as they can affect large areas, and also we're looking at higher intensities of some of these and over certain areas of the country. So I'm sure that by this time you're ready for a little break. So maybe you want to stand up and stretch your legs and think about this question. Where was the location of the 6.0 magnitude earthquake in the Philippines that just occurred on June 26th, 2025? So I'll pause here and let you think about it for a second. And then I will show you the answer. And this was the earthquake that just happened. And as you know, there were more than one, there was more than one tremor that happened during that time period. So you can certainly use this and go back and look at some more information based on the portal that I'll share with you shortly. So now that we've kind of talked about the background of what is an earthquake, what contributes to the development of an earthquake, what actually makes the shaking that we feel, and we know that obviously what to expect during an earthquake are unfortunately things that we have experienced. So some we may have experienced, whether it's a smaller magnitude or intensity earthquake or a larger one is the ground shaking. But there are lots of other factors that come in that are of concern that happen during an earthquake. And of course, in a couple of slides coming up here, we will also discuss what to expect after an earthquake. So during an earthquake, we can expect things like landslides, sometimes surface fault slips, liquefaction, which, as you may know, is when water-saturated sediment loses strength and acts as a fluid. So that could be quite dangerous. Other things like other ground failure, tsunamis, and seiches, where it's that sloshing of water in an area. It could happen in a pool. It could happen in another body of water where you have that sort of movement of water that can actually go on for quite a bit, even after the shaking stops. So let's look at now very quickly, and I have a few slides, so I'm just going to run through these. I won't read through each and every one, but I just want you to think about what are all of the different types of hazards that follow an earthquake. So an earthquake usually lasts a short period of time, and of course we may have aftershocks and before shocks, so it could be a series of events. But really, we're thinking about when we have a major earthquake, there could be significant hazards that follow that earthquake that can have cascading events, and a lot of times they can impact one another quite a bit. So if we think about things that probably are more common, for example, fires, structural damage, buildings that maybe we will not be able to re-enter them or we may not be able to rebuild them. There, of course, unfortunately, there may be injuries and fatalities associated with a strong earthquake. And then, of course, people are the most important part of every disaster, and that is that they may need shelter. So if there are buildings that are destroyed or if there are places where people live or work are destroyed, they're going to need shelter and they need to be placed in other safe areas, especially in the case of if there are any aftershocks. There are lots of other things. For example, sometimes if there's a lot of damage, there's a lot of debris that has to be moved. Electric power could be lost. There could be communications failure due to electrical power losses, and also water systems could be impacted. A lot of times when earthquakes happen, and if there are ways for people to leave, but also sometimes, as you can see in this image, there are structural damage to roads, so that could really lead to difficulty in terms of traffic delays and detours that could go on. Also, public transportation may not be available, and also just moving about these areas could become very challenging. And of course, as we talked about injuries and unfortunate fatalities, hospitals and healthcare are going to suffer disruptions, and there's going to be delays and shortages of various things that may be needed. And whenever we go through any disaster, and of course, if it is a major disaster, but really any disaster leads to trauma, and trauma can have an impact of that can lead to mental health issues. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, especially in the case of your students, that this may be something that I'm sure you're aware that there are things that we can do to help, but there are also signs that we need to look out for, especially during these difficult times. So again, lots of things that can affect. So not only sort of our infrastructure in terms of electricity, communication, water, but there could also be supply chain issues. There could be businesses that may have to close or relocate. There could also be significant changes in the community. So kind of going back to what we talked about in terms of the importance of the community and importance of the school to the community, it could be significant changes. People may leave their communities. Sometimes they have no option. Normally, people don't want to leave their communities. Most of the time, they're not even able to leave their communities. But depending on the damage and depending on the conditions that may happen, and schools may become unavailable. So that's something that we really need to think about, that how would we go about educating the students if the school physically is not available. And we'll talk about the importance of having contingency plans for when schools may not be able to operate in the way that they operated before the earthquake. One of the things that I noticed during my visit, and I'm sure you know about as you are thinking about all of these things during especially the month of July, but also in terms of your training and going through these webinars, is this shift from reactive to proactive, which is really, really important. We have learned quite a bit around the world from previous experiences from all different kinds of disasters, whether they were natural or unfortunate man-contributed hazards. We know that it's really important to be prepared. If we're better prepared, we can be better responders, and we can also have a quicker recovery. So I was very happy to see that there's this policy shift in the Philippines as well to try to have this approach to be proactive. And if you are proactive and you're better prepared, you can also try to build more resilient communities. And whether those communities are people that are well informed and know what to do during a disaster, but it also in terms of resiliency of structures and infrastructure as well. I wanted to share just two portals, as I mentioned, that allow you to look up real-time information. They allow you to also access some of the earthquake data. So one of them is this Hazard Hunter, which is the hazard assessment at your fingertips. That is, you can enter your current location, you can use coordinates, and it really allows you to access a lot of information. So this is very useful. And some of you may have seen this particular portal. Again, it focuses on showing you where are the latest areas of activity. So you can, this is interactive and it's real time, and it's a really useful resource. So you can see the web link here, and many of you may have already seen it, but it's a very useful tool. And this is a nice tool that if you do have internet access in your classrooms, or even if you can gather the information and use it to inform your students and to educate your students, is a really useful tool. And just wanted to share that with you. There's also Philippine Seismic Risk Reduction and Resilience Project, which is quite important too. And it touches on all the things that I mentioned in terms of improving multi-hazard resilience. So this includes earthquakes of public buildings and facilities. And and I know that there are lots of efforts in place to build more resilient school buildings. So this is something that is important. So I just wanted to share that with you. Again, you may be aware of it, but you can access through the following link to read more and learn more about this particular project. So I did want to mention again and kind of stress this upon, and I think all of you are very, really well aware of this, but social impacts of earthquakes are really important. So we talked about all of those different impacts on, what we need are food, water, electricity, communication systems, right? Those are extremely important. But one of the most important impacts is the impact on people. And so in this case, for you as educators and teachers, it's you're well aware of how important schools are in lives of the community, not just for the students, but for the parents, for the family, and for the entire community as a whole. So Schools are really important, and they always rank, as I say here, near the top of the list of critical facilities that need to reduce risk. So it's really important to protect the students, but it's also important to make sure that schools are safe places that can be used for the community as well, right? And especially since I know they're really important in the Philippines in terms of those community centers. So teachers are really important in the school community, and there are some things that teachers can do. And I know that some of you already know are doing these, and it's quite important to be thinking about them in terms of what more can be done. But leading by examples. So we really feel that it's important that teachers are provided with the training and resources to help them with some of these things that you're being asked to do. And I know you're already doing in terms of safety planning, drills and exercises and education in schools. But that training is quite important, right? You need to have the training and you need to have the resources to be able to do these properly and effectively. It's also quite important to build a safety culture. So involving students in different safety projects, whether it's hazard mapping or integrating it into everything from art to theater to mathematics. And I'll give you a couple of examples of these in an upcoming slide. It's quite important to not only inform the students, but also it will have a cascading effects of informing the parents and building a culture of preparedness. As I mentioned before, I think schools working with the communities is really important, and teachers are the direct link between the students and the community. So it's really important that they're provided with the resources. So I know that some of these things are easier said than done, but the resources that come from, whether it's from Department of Education, trickling down to the schools and then available to you, are really important. And of course, you know, if schools are built well, as I mentioned before, they could also be used as shelters and they could really help the community during a disaster. So if we really think about this, the role of the teachers and school itself in the community are extremely important, both from developing a culture of preparedness, from being a safety, a location of safety, and also a safe place from all accounts. So extremely critical. So when we look at what goes into earthquake preparedness, I've mentioned the term earthquake preparedness quite a bit. So when we talk about this, what do we really mean? I am certain that you have heard of a school emergency plan, and your school probably has one. I am sure that many of you have participated in drills, whether they were earthquake drills or perhaps they were fire drills. And then, of course, there are other things that need to be done that you may or may not have been involved with. And those are non-structural and structural safety that are also quite important. So structural safety is critical, right? Because in the event of an earthquake, the structure itself is extremely important if it's built properly and has those safety measures in place. But also there are non-structural safety. So there are things inside of the classroom that could be secured. So when students do drop, cover, and hold, there are objects that perhaps we could secure or perhaps make sure that they're moved away from exits and hallways and walkways. So there are things that can be done. And then also communication. So keeping an up-to-date class roster, emergency contact list, and continuously updating those. Again, that's something that the school can do, but also it can be done at the classroom level with you as the teacher. And perhaps you're doing some of this and all of this in some capacity. But the reason I just wanted to put this all together, these are kind of the key components that need to be there. There are a lot of other factors that come in underneath each of these that I'm sure you may know about, or I'm sure you've been introduced to. But in terms of some key, these 5 items are really, really important to keep in mind. So let's just briefly talk about what are the actions for earthquake preparedness, both from a school perspective and a teacher perspective. And I want to sort of clarify this because a lot of times when we look at actions for earthquake preparedness, it's just a big list, long list of different types of actions. And it's not clear who's responsible for them. And a lot of times this leads to people not knowing what to do. They go hand in hand, right? So as teachers, you don't operate all on your own, and schools don't operate completely on their own because they have to abide by policies and rules that are coming from the Department of Education. And then, of course, they're sharing things with you. So they're all connected, right? And let's not forget the community because you're dealing with students that have parents and family, and the community is also part of your school. So they're all connected. So these actions need to be identified in a way that everyone can take sort of a ownership of those particular actions. So there's some outcome that then these different entities can actually work together. So that sort of identification of those roles and responsibilities are really important. So I've put together two slides. One is for schools and one is for teachers. And I know that you as educators may not look at all of those things that are listed under schools, but I think it's important for you to realize that there's some things that perhaps is good if they're done at the school level. So then it makes it easier for you to do what you need to do as a teacher to be effective in the event of a disaster, and in this case, an earthquake event. So schools, there's a long list, but many of these things are already being done, but it's just making sure that they're done properly and that some of these items require annual checkups and annual updates. So having an earthquake preparedness plan that's updated at least annually. This could be done, biannually, or it could be done, depending on the size of the school, the location of the school, the number of students. I know that many of your schools have a large number of students. So in terms of, that plan, that could change depending on the number of students, the changes in the community. So there's a lot of factors that can change and contribute to that, so that it needs to be updated. Teacher training, I can't stress this upon this. I already mentioned it in another slide, but it is extremely important to have proper teacher training. And I know some of these are already taking place, but I'll mention some of the others that are really important. And again, they are training that need to be done on a regular basis to make sure that everyone is up to date with their knowledge and they feel comfortable with the information, because you can take a training one time and this happens to me, that you may not remember all the important factors. So and some of this training may change depending on the preparedness plan and the drills that your school or your community decides to do. So that's important as well. Providing resources for things like emergency kits, whether they're for the classroom or also providing them for the students so they can have them, because I know that there are some communities and some students and families that may not be able to put together that emergency kit. So that help from the school is extremely important, to provide those emergency kits if at all possible, or at least have one for each classroom. Fire extinguishers and other emergency supplies for each classroom. These are critical to have. Opportunities for realistic earthquake drills. I have watched a couple of videos, and also when I was visiting the one school, the principal was explaining to me how the drill was done. And I know these are overwhelming because you have a large number of students, you have the spaces are limited, the open spaces where the way that the buildings are structured. So need to think about how to make these realistic earthquake drills so that students really take the responsibility and participate in these and really understand. So these exercises and these frequent exercises are really important to do. Creating a community outreach program on earthquake preparedness and safety is really important because if you do this in conjunction with the community, it is not just something that's taking place at school, because eventually, if an event happens, the whole community is going to be involved. So that community outreach component is really important to make sure that you have understanding of both sides of what is going to happen. After each drill, there should be a mock evaluation. What went right? What went wrong? What are some of the things that can be done? And this is something that we sometimes don't do. We do drills. And I know even at our university, sometimes we do drills, but there's no after evaluation. And that's critical because if you don't do that, you're not really thinking about, okay, we did the drill, but what are some of the areas that need to be improved? And this is where we learn where are those holes, where are those areas where more attention is needed. And then working really with parents and families and the community on those family reunification plans. This is something that students can start in the class, in schools, and then sharing those with the parents and communities and families. Extremely important. During an event, a lot of times everyone rushes to the school or rushes to a community center. And sometimes that may not be possible. Remember that I showed you those slides of what we can expect after a disaster. And it may not be possible to get to a certain location, whether it's a school or it's the community center or, for example, a particular area. So each student really needs to develop a family reunification plan, and a school and teachers are the critical components to help them do that with the community. That can make a significant impact. And again, structural safety, that's something that schools need to do. That's probably not something that you want to deal with, but is something that you want to be aware of. Where are things with structural safety? Because that is one of the most crucial factors in terms of safety when it comes to earthquake planning and preparation. And then along with the drills, of course, there's always an evacuation plan because, as we mentioned, buildings may not be safe to stay in. So there needs to be, and also if there is any kind of a gas leak or fire, there needs to be an evacuation plan. It may not be safe to stay inside the building after an earthquake event. And of course, these databases of students, which I'm sure all your schools keep, but keeping that up to date is extremely important. So let's focus on you and what are some of the things that you may be able to do in your capacity as a teacher that is doable. So one of the things that one of the references that I've provided towards the end gives you a couple of examples of student safety guides that have been developed in other countries that are also affected by major disasters. And this would be something really simple and short. We're talking about maybe a one page, maybe it could be in the form of a poster that can be put on the classroom walls, or it could be in hallways, just something that students can look at and kind of as a reminder in between those drills and other types of exercises. Updated list of students, again, indoor earthquake drill in the classroom, wherever it's possible to incorporate it into the curriculum. And I have some slides on some of these items with a little bit more detail. Maintaining a classroom emergency kit. Do a monthly structural safety check. So this would be inside of your classroom. So I'm sure all of you have other objects in your classroom other than the desks and chairs. So making sure if there are any heavy items, if there are things hanging on the walls, if there's, for example, a bookshelf or any kind of a structure that is loose, that all of those are secured. And that makes a big difference because heavy objects tend to fall, as you may know well, during an earthquake, and that can cause serious injuries. It could also block pathways for evacuation. Again, if there are any opportunities for you to do teacher training, maybe even something like this webinar could be helpful to make you think about some items that perhaps in your capacity you would be able to do for your students and for your school and for your community. And also a contingency plan that includes our alternative modes of delivery and teaching. I know that during my visit, it was shared with me that during the coronavirus or the COVID-19 pandemic, there was a lot of materials produced to do some kind of remote learning. And I know that this can be difficult because computers and internet access is not available to everyone. So there needs to be a realistic contingency plan that doesn't just rely on everyone having access to a computer or to the internet. And that's something that is of a challenge. We face it as well, with students in different areas of the country. So I'm sure you're facing that as well. So it's something to think about, that what are some alternative ways of thinking about this. And then, of course, one of the other ways that we can connect with the parents and the community as teachers, and you know this well, is during parent-teacher meetings and conferences. And those may not be the best way, because I know that sometimes not everyone comes to those. It's not possible to hold those for every single student at all times on a regular basis. But as much as possible, it would be helpful to have those in order to, again, share information about safety, about preparedness, again, to promote that culture of preparedness and culture of safety in your community. So as I mentioned, I have a couple of slides that share a little bit more information on those particular action items for you as teachers. And again, these are just suggestions. Some of them you may say, we already have this. Some of them you may see, well, we're doing one aspect of it. And some of it you may say, this is really, it may not work. There has to be more resources from the school in order for this to happen. But I'm hoping that it's helpful, and maybe in some cases it can plant a seed for something that can happen in the future. So this student safety guide, again, I mentioned this, and there's a reference from United Nations at the very end of this presentation under references that shares some information in terms of other countries that have developed these student safety guides. They also some have developed teacher safety guides. So depending on what you need, and I know that there are some teacher safety guides that have already been developed through the Department of Education. So you may want to just build on those or use those, and they may be sufficient for what your needs are. I also mentioned that at any time, if it's possible to integrate and incorporate classroom activities and learning experiences, that may be very powerful, because we can do drills and we can tell students that, do what is needed inside of a classroom in case something happens, and then we can do the evacuation. So our drills can be very, very good and very effective. But there's something about students really thinking about what happens during an earthquake. What are some of the things they need to do to be better prepared at the individual level with their families and within the community? And to also learn more. And it could also generate some interest in them in terms of becoming more interested in whether it's science, whether it's service activities, to become first responders, to become, members of the community that have skill sets that could be really useful during disasters. So I think integration of these and there could be just small things depending on how much time you have, or there could work really well depending on the subjects that you teach. So it may not be relevant in all cases, but it could be useful. Some suggestions is, writing, having them write about different aspects of earthquakes, specifically, of course, earthquakes in the Philippines, past events. Science, write about the scientific aspects. What are some of the latest findings on earthquakes? Why is it that we can't predict earthquakes far in advance? What are the networks of earthquake information that exist? How do we measure it? Building very simple models of earthquakes and slip faults and so forth. Art and theater. portrayal of earthquakes, and this could be, not to build it in a way that would scare them, but to think about, what would happen, so that you could also do that in a way that could be useful in terms of reminding them of safety actions. Mathematics, solve mathematical problems, how much material is moved, how do we measure, when we have like water saturated sediments, how do we measure the movement of it? So those could be science and math together. History, again, we always learn from history. We look at past events, how it has affected the community, what was done, what can be done. Civics and government, again, government agencies that provide aid. I know that many of your drills are done with other agencies that are really important in terms of risk reduction, disaster risk reduction activities and mitigation. So extremely important to be thinking about those, having them think about those people and those agencies that do this. And it can also, again, as I mentioned earlier, introduce them to some of these other opportunities and get them interested. And then health, of course, physical and mental health, but there's also impact on food, water, other vital resources. You can have an activity where they put together their emergency safety kit if materials can be made available by the school. And you may do this already in some settings, but this would be a really useful way that would also equip the students, especially those that do not have the financial capability or other resources to be able to do this with their families. And that could be a really important, useful exercise. So I think it's time for another break. So we can take maybe a couple of seconds of the break. And if you can come up with one example of how you would incorporate earthquake preparedness and safety into what you teach your students, and how would you go about including it in your existing lessons? I want to really, welcome you to send me questions at the end of the presentation. I have included my email address. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and I would love to hear from you in terms of, what you're already doing in your classroom, in terms of some of the things that I mentioned, and if you're willing to share. One of the things that I have found really useful in my 27 years of teaching is things that I've learned from my students and from other colleagues of what are best practices, what are the things that you're doing that is working well, how are you presenting this material? So if you have things to share, or if you would like to find a way to share things with other teachers, please reach out. So I'll pause a second, let you think about this, and then we'll move on. So one of the other things that I think is really important, and I mentioned at the very bottom of what are some of the things you can do in the classroom, is the development of the emergency kit. And I know the school I visited, there were some, but I'm not really sure if there were one in each classroom space, because that's really important to at least have one for the class. This is an extended list that really includes a lot, but really there's some pieces that hopefully would be easier to at least put together for each classroom. So a flashlight and whistle, radio, first aid kit, that a roster of students. Sometimes it's important to have these wrenches to be able to turn off gas and water supply. Especially gas is important, because if there's a gas leak, you want to be able to at least turn that off, if at all possible, to not lead to any kind of fire or explosions. Water, some food, at least for a short period of time. And then, of course, there are other things that I have included here. It's really, really important is that a lot of times we put these emergency kits together and then we don't really take the time to check them annually. And I know that I have seen this in many settings. And it's really important, especially when we're including food and water. We want to make sure that they're not past those expiration dates. It's really important sometimes in every school to have maybe one or two teachers designated to check those things, check the batteries, check the expiration dates on the food and water. So sometimes having, one teacher trained, whether it's you or a colleague, and you can switch, it's really important and useful to do that. And I did mention those structural and classroom safety checks. Again, this is something you can do in your own classroom. It doesn't have to be daily, but maybe each week you can check the classrooms to see if there are any hazards, because things shift and move. So maybe daily is too much, but at least maybe once a week, every other week, those are important. And then evacuation in terms of your own classroom. So if there's shaking in the classroom, initially you're going to stay and go under the desk and, or under some structure for all the students. But I think planning the evacuation is important as well. And then, of course, this idea of the utilities, especially if there are any areas that are near your classroom, to be able to know where to shut that off if you need to. So those are things that are just very basic, preparedness, the kit, and also the structural and classroom safety checks. I know that I have mentioned this a few times, but really teacher training is really, really important. And I know that some of you may have already gone through this as part of your teacher training, but some of these is important to keep up with them and also repeat them. So you are familiar with the latest information, your skills are refreshed. So things that are really critical are this first aid and light search and rescue, first aid skills, and then also fire safety. These are quite important. And then we offer, and this is something that I will share with you at the end, something called Community Emergency Response Team Training, which really takes the idea of some of these things that I have mentioned. So first aid, light search and rescue, basic medical operations, some, disaster psychology, and then fire safety, all of these things. But it also has the model of train the trainer. So we really take the idea that if you are trained, you can train another teacher. You can even train your students in some of these areas. So it's really important to be thinking about that as you approach this model. So whether all you and your colleagues go through this training, but it's also important to make sure that others are trained as well. And then I can't stress the collaboration with student families and community. So this idea of finding a way to inform parents and family members, whether they're guides, whether there's something that is shared during meetings, or whether it's something that's sent home with the students, or if there are any opportunities for community drills. I know that in some areas, along with the other agencies, there are some opportunities for this, but because a lot of times drills are done strictly in the school and there's no community engagement, and that's really important. And there are lots of, local resources. I know that in the Philippines, there are excellent, local disaster response offices, and that may be an excellent way to try to engage. And I think sometimes as a teacher, it may be a good first point. And I know your schools are thinking about this, and your Department of Education is taking this very seriously, but you may want to think about this from your perspective as well. So what happens during an earthquake? So I have just a couple of slides, and it won't take long. We're sort of getting to the end of this presentation. If an earthquake happens, what you should do. So we've kind of talked about the science. We've talked about what will happen, what to expect. We have talked about what are the things that we can do in anticipation of an event. So all of these things that we've come to this point is in terms of preparedness, planning for a potential earthquake. But if it does happen, what should be the responsibilities of you as a teacher? So what we call the first responder during an earthquake. So first and foremost, if you're inside of the classroom, you know this really well. I know that you have done drills on this drop, cover, and hold. And you can see this cartoon that's from FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency in the United States, and this cartoon, which I'm sure you've seen lots of images like this, that shows this idea that is very important: drop, cover, and hold. Stay in place until the shaking stops. And as I mentioned earlier, sometimes you have shocks that come before the main tremor, and then there are also aftershocks, which are less intense shaking that happen. So it may be essential to just stay, and then if you feel another shaking, to do another drop, cover, and hold at the first sign of shaking. If you're outside, you may want to instruct the students to move into the open, away from the buildings, fences, trees, street lights, any of those, as much as possible. I know that in some of your schools, the open areas may be limited. There may be lots of buildings surrounding them, but if at all possible, move into an open space. And you want to have your students kneel or sit on the ground and cover their head and face with their hands and stay in place until the shaking stops. So once the earthquake stops, the very first thing that you want to do yourself is to determine if it's safe to move. You need to check yourself first and then look for any possible injuries. And then you also want to, check others for any possible injuries. And if there is something that needs first aid, you need to administer that. It's very important to conduct a head count of your students and others that may have been in your classroom, a visitor, a speaker, a colleague that may have been in your classroom. If you're inside and you feel that it is safe to move about, you may want to decide whether or not you want to evacuate or you want to stay inside, depending on, again, the structural integrity of your school and what you're seeing. You have to determine if there's a gas leak or any kind of electrical damage. Those are really important. And always, at all times, even if the shaking had stopped, you need to be prepared for aftershocks, because they could happen, as I'm sure you have experienced in your country, that a lot of times those aftershocks may continue for a while, and they may come in sort of times where you're not necessarily, it's not a particular period of time in terms of occurrence. It is really, really important to make sure that there's no gas leak. I'm sort of repeating this a little bit, but, you need to evacuate if there is any kind of smell of gas. You want to make sure that if you're not able to leave, you want to open the window. And this is where we talked about that it's important to know if there's a valve near your classroom, to be familiar with it, to shut off electricity or gas, and to know how to do that. So you can do that quickly, because sometimes you may not be able to wait for someone to arrive and do that. So having the proper tools and knowing where those locations are quite important. Now, unless you must evacuate immediately, which is, if there's fire, if there's severe structural damage, or if there's a gas leak, or there's kind of a hazardous material spill, you want to try to stay put until it is safe to evacuate and the evacuation route is clear. If there's anybody that is injured, you don't want to move them. It may be more dangerous to them to move them, unless you feel that then when they're inside, they're in immediate danger. Then you have to, you may want to wait until someone can properly move them. One of the things that you will learn in a light search and rescue training course is how to do that. That if there is injury, there are procedures for, how to position the person, how to move them if it is absolutely needed. And again, if you have any kind of fire damage to a structure, a gas leak, or hazardous material spill, you want to leave immediately. If you must evacuate, and in the case of an evacuation, you want to make sure that you're following the evacuation routes and the evacuation plan that I had mentioned earlier, and to go to a designated safe gathering place. this is why it's so important to have an emergency kit in the class. If there's an emergency kit in the class, you want to take that with you, and also your class roster to be able to keep track of all the students in your class, and also to have the safety kit, at least for the time being, in those first few hours until help arrives. Okay. Then I want to stress this is, of course, the recovery period can be very extensive depending on what are the after effects of an earthquake. As I mentioned, if you remember, we had about 3 or 4 slides that talked about all the different things that can happen in terms of structure, access, place we live, place we work. There could be lots of those things that can go on for sometimes days, weeks, months, and unfortunately, sometimes even longer than that. So one of the things that is really critical in terms of you as teachers, and I know you know this well because you are teachers and your number one priority is your students, is the psychological support for the students. So we kind of can protect them physically by being prepared, by having all those things in place, having structural integrity in the classroom, in the school, having a plan, having an emergency kit, having the training to know what to do in those first few critical hours, and a plan, and also making sure that everyone, the parents and the community, are aware of those plans. But there's something that happens during a disaster, and that is the psychological impact. So it's really important to stay calm and reassuring when something is happening in the immediate aftermath of an event, in this case, an earthquake. But it's also important to continue to listen and observe and encourage your students to express their feelings if they want, and then as much as possible to go back to routine and to activity. So this is, again, why it is critical to have a contingency plan for if the school setting is not the same, or if the access to school materials or the students' access to the school building itself and materials is not the same, to have a plan. So there is a way for students to re-enter and re-engage and kind of go back to those activities, and that would help them with their recovery period. So if you can help them with the recovery period, I think then everyone can do better in terms of those psychological changes. And then, of course, it's important to think about professional help, and I'm sure that these are available in your schools in terms of school counselors, psychologists, and all of that, and if we need to involve them as well. So here are some key takeaways that I want to leave with you. Preparedness saves lives. I think I've mentioned this so many times during this webinar, and you know this well. You have been doing these drills and the training and planning. These are all really important, and if they're done well, and if they're checked on a regular basis, and the resources are available for them, they can make a world of difference. Teacher leadership, again, you as teachers are the most important people in the students' lives, in addition to their families. And your work along with the communities is really important, not only when a disaster happens, but also afterwards in terms of recovery period. The continuous improvement is important. So I think, again, this is something that has been highlighted in this presentation quite a bit, and that is, depending on if it's a plan, if it's a drill, they all need to be updated. They need to be evaluated on a regular basis to make sure that they're still effective, they're still appropriate, and the resources are there to carry them out in an effective manner. Again, we can talk about things, but the actions surrounding those and the resources are quite critical. And then, of course, this culture of safety that goes beyond the school walls, that goes beyond the students. It goes into the families and it goes into the community. So by integrating some of those activities, by talking about them, by holding drills that involves everyone, by even providing some training opportunities where the teachers that are trained can train the students and in turn can train community members, and knowing what community members are capable of, all of that communication and all of that sort of preparedness, kind of the whole community approach, is really the most effective in order for us to be able to respond and recover from a disaster. So I'll end my presentation with just a couple of things. These are some additional training opportunities that may become available through the Department of Education. So one is what I have mentioned to you, that Community Emergency Response Team training, and it would cover some of these topics. There'll be additional topics, but I just didn't want to list all of them. So these are some. And this would be sort of the short course that you would be able to go through and complete these with, more detailed information. And this is one. Then there's another one that could be on the design and implementation of school preparedness plans, tabletop exercises, and family reunification plans. So this could go into detail of preparedness planning, the design and development of effective drills and exercises, and those family and community reunification planning, and also communication. And then last but not least is the incident command system for schools. So a lot of times when disaster happens, we need to know who is doing what, right? So I've kind of tried to mention that to you in terms of preparedness planning, that there are responsibilities that fall on, the administrative sort of side of things, the school itself, and then you as teachers. But when a disaster happens, it's also extremely important to understand this, what we call incident command system, which goes into, who are the staff members that, kind of we can look at a chart and see who's responsible for what, who has the information. If that person is not there, who would be the backup? All of that information is quite important. And these need to go into the drills as well, right? So we really understand what is the command structure. So when you have, an incident happening, who's responsible and what's going to happen in terms of those initial responses, and then, of course, long-term response and recovery. So that response framework is something else that we'll touch upon on some of these training opportunities. So I just wanted to share these with you, that in addition to those basic sort of first aid and fire safety and all of that, there are other opportunities for these trainings to help you as a teacher, but also help your school, help your students, and of course, help your community. Thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to speak with you about earthquake preparedness, and hopefully this has been an effective and helpful webinar for you to gain some information and perhaps build on the knowledge that you already know, and provide you with some new ways to improve your preparedness planning and also response and recovery during an earthquake event. I've included my contact information. Please don't hesitate to reach out with any comments, questions. If you want to share some of the classroom activities and are interested in sharing those with others, please let me know. And then on the last slide, I have some references for you on some of the things that I have used. Thank you again, and be safe.